When lately I retired to my house, resolved that, insofar as I could, I would cease to concern myself with anything except the passing in rest and retirement of the little time I still have to live, I could do my mind no better service than to leave it in complete idleness to commune with itself, to come to rest and to grow settled, which I hoped it would thenceforth be able to do more easily, since it had become graver and more mature with time. But I find, variam semper dant otia mentem, that, on the contrary, like a runaway horse, it is 100 times more active on its own behalf than ever it was for others. It presents me with so many chimeras and imaginary monsters, one after another, without order or plan, that in order to contemplate their oddness and absurdity at leisure, I have begun to record them in writing, hoping in time to make my mind ashamed of them.
And welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we'll be looking at the essays of Michel de Montaigne. And after 5 years and 100 episodes, if you include all of our bonus episodes, we're going to be shaking things up a little bit. We are making something that was previously kind of implicit in our project here, a little more explicit, by bringing together older, quote-unquote, great books in conversation with our ongoing lives as readers and as human beings with the wonderful books that we have encountered along the way. So we're going to be incorporating some newer books into the mix, and we're also doing a little formal experiment. We're recording this cluster of episodes all at once over the course of a weekend, at least, from a secret location on the Upper West Side of New York. It's very exciting. These changes we're very excited about, but we're giving them a try, so we hope you will join us on this adventure. And they were inspired in at least part by this text itself, by Montaigne's essays which proudly situate themselves within the author's experience and the texts and stories and people that he encounters or gathers around him, and which encourage him to push to find new forms that might capture that situation. So I'm excited about this.
I am too. I feel like I have a sense of where we're going, but I don't know exactly what the road is going to look like on the way there. So that's always a great place to be.
Which is exactly like reading these essays, which, if anybody listening hasn't read them, they come with a title. And that title feels like it's going to be very obvious: on friendship, on raising children, on liars. And then you look at these essays and you read through them. And while it does eventually work its way to touch upon that, that's often not what the essay is about. And it doesn't even coherently stick to one topic.
No, it varies so much. Sometimes the title of the essay is, in fact, where we start. But a lot of times we start in a completely different place. And even if we start with the topic of the title, we end up somewhere totally different. And when the end comes, sometimes it feels like an end, and sometimes it's just, it stops. And you're like, what?
So the essays here are sort of understood as the birth of essays. The creation myth of the essay as a format comes from this collection, even though the essays that we typically see or get assigned to do in school or whatnot, or read in the New Yorker or some other such publication, they look very little like what you find in this book.
No, it's incredibly ironic. I mean, this is something we were reflecting about together not too long ago. If you think about an essay as it shows up in a high school class or a college or university class, it's got to be formal and have a particular kind of structure. You're disciplined in how to write an essay. And so there's this incredible irony if you teach Montaigne's essays, because the students, when you ask them to write an essay, they're like, well, what do you mean?
Exactly. Should it look like this? Should it just be one thought following into another, with a few stories and quotations along the way? Or should it be structured? Should it have a driving argument that is, getting to a point and is doing so swiftly and rhetorically accurately? He makes fun of rhetoricians in this book for doing that, and he seems unimpressed with it. And yet that is often what we're asking students to do when engaging with this text.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting what you were saying about they don't have a structure of the essays. And I think you're absolutely right. They don't have that kind of formal, imposed rhetorical structure, 100%. But they have a structure like in the way, I don't know, a riverbed has a structure. You know what I mean? Like there's a form, I guess I would say, even though there's not a structure.
Right. There is structure, but there is not the structure. Like essays, I mean, there are multiple types of essays and so forth, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that more later. But there is still a sense of, when you read an essay today, you kind of know how to read it. You have a sense of the map of the essay. And it's a very daring essay that surprises you with its form.
Exactly. And I hope that's something as we continue on in this kind of highly concentrated mega cluster, I guess, that we're doing together, we'll really be able to see some of the ways people have pushed at those edges.
Yeah, that is broadly what we're going to be talking about for the next few episodes, is how essays and also stories, in a very particular sense of the term, operate in this situated and exploratory space.
Yeah, and even how we can think about them not just as forms, so the essay form, the story form, but essaying, storying, in other words, as verbs that are about making and doing and being even.
Yeah, and I hope we also have a moment to think about this form that we're doing right now, this podcast, as it's always been and as it continues to be, where, there are podcasts that are radio shows that are structured and you listen to them and they're telling you a narrative or an argument. And then there's this other form, which is the kind of podcast that we've been making, which are conversations that have some structure or form to them. We always start with the quote of the passage and we introduce it and we tell you a little bit about the author and et cetera, et cetera. But although we take notes and we think beforehand about what we might want to talk about, we enter into this conversation open-minded and open-ended as to where exactly it's going to go. And it does get edited afterwards to make sure that it is a satisfying listening experience. But it still is shaggy and somewhat unpredictable, we hope.
Yeah, wandering.
Exactly. And situated in our present moment. But shall we talk a little bit about Montaigne's moment? Just a little bit of context of where he's coming from as he's sitting down to write a big fat book of essays.
A big fat book, and a book that got fatter over time. Montaigne was writing in the 16th century, so flourishing a little bit before the time of Shakespeare, just for a reference point. He comes from a very wealthy and aristocratic family, but an aristocratic and wealthy family of a particular kind. Their wealth had come largely from trade and mercantile kinds of activity, and in fact, quite a number of members of his family had come from Iberia, from Spain, and from Portugal, with sort of mixed Sephardic Jewish ancestry, people who had converted to Christianity at a certain point. So he inhabits the aristocracy and inhabits this very wealthy class, but in a slightly strange kind of way. He lived at Aquitaine, so in a province in the southwestern part of France, which is sort of, again, between regions. It's a region that has a lot of autonomy from the Middle Ages from antiquity on, but inhabits an odd spot. And the reason that's worth mentioning is Montaigne is living in a time of tremendous political and social turmoil, especially around wars of religion between Christian factions, so Catholic and Protestant, and there's a much more nuanced way to talk about that, but that's the world he's living in. And the region he's living in experiences that in a particular way. And it's worth mentioning that because it provides a context for understanding his reasons for withdrawing in the way he does and kind of entering into this very private world of the mind. Sometimes that decision gets talked about as a very private individual decision, and I think it is that, but it's also a response to a world that he's inhabiting. He was in an arranged marriage and had 6 children, 6 daughters, and only one of them survived infancy. And I mention that because it seems like that death of that first child was part of the personal circumstances of life, which included a riding accident, which caused him to withdraw. Those are the personal parts of his withdrawal. Other neat personal detail about him, which I think is absolutely nuts, is he was raised so that Latin would be his first language.
Which was not common in the 1500s.
No. Of course, very, very common to be educated in Latin, to start your education in Latin at a certain age, usually around 7 or so for boys. Occasionally girls would be educated in Latin, but that was much rarer. But his father thought that was really important to start that education from day one. And so he had a tutor, Montaigne tells us, who was a German person who did not speak French, whether that's true or not, at least certainly did not speak French to the little Montaigne. And the household was ordered to address him only in Latin. So he describes the effects of that upbringing on him. And as I mentioned, his volume of essays gets fatter and fatter over time. He brought out the first edition in 1580, so about 10 years after his withdrawal into that private life of the mind, and then published subsequent editions that change in size about every 7 to 10 years. And a lot of times editions will kind of mark the essays as to whether they're part of the A cycle, the B cycle, or the C cycle, which came out actually after his death. So this was a book that was growing over time along with him, and he talks about this. And we can think about other writers we read who have similar trajectories, who have one work, and it's a work that grows and accretes more to it over time.
I found that one of the frustrating things about looking at editions and translations of this book is that many of them are really invested in letting you know which passages are coming from which edition. Because it's not like, this essay is from the second edition. It's this clause in the middle of this paragraph comes from it. So we're switching from this to that and then back again. And it just interrupts the flow of the text. And I understand wanting to provide that information for a reader, especially if you're doing a scholarly edition. But as a person who's reading it not to commune with history, but just to read, just as a text I want to read and understand, I would have liked a little bit more editorial intervention in making it a smoother reading experience. You get used to it, but it's a frustration.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. You see something kind of similar with Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which also undergoes that kind of expansion and growth over time. And yeah, I guess it's important to be able to historicize the text in that way. And there is a whole body of scholarship around that. But as a reader, you want to enjoy it a little differently. And also, not to talk all about authorial intent, but they're trying to give you a sense of something that grows organically over time. Right? So compartmentalizing it and rhetoricizing it, so to speak, is probably the last thing that they're looking for you to do.
Well, I feel like we should start by looking at one of the essays, maybe one of the more typical essays in a collection of very differing works. What's one that struck you as, that's the kind of essay I think of when I think of a Montaigne essay?
Yeah, and they vary tremendously in terms of length, as you'll have noticed, right? Some of them are quite short, some of them are very long. It's that kind of organic quality, like same way you might be out in a garden and like one plant is very small, one plant is very large, right? They're a bit like that.
This is an essay collection of dogs, not cats.
I kind of like On Idleness as a way of showing the essay format because it is self-reflective because he's actually talking about the essay format even while he's doing it. So he's kind of acting it out while he's telling you about it. So it opens up like this. He says, as we see ground that lies fallow, teeming, if rich and fertile, with countless kinds of wild and useless plants, and observe that to keep it serviceable, we must master it and sow it with various crops of use to ourselves. So it is with our minds. If we do not occupy them with some definite subject which curbs and restrains them, they rush wildly to and fro in the ill-defined field of the imagination. So he moves from this opening where he's talking about the field of the imagination to talking about the quality of the mind as being full of chimeras and imaginary monsters, right? As you saw in the cold open. And he says then, to contemplate their oddness and absurdity at leisure, I've begun to record them in writing, right? And so he's describing here a process of going from the things that fill your imagination are kind of uncontrolled and wild like an overgrown garden, and you make them into something. You give them a kind of form. You don't give them that disciplined rhetorical form that he will mock, but there's something that you can preserve. You can put it into a place where you can share it with others. So it's this weird paradoxical kind of movement. So I feel like that's always a nice one to talk about because it's there that he's sort of self-consciously talking about what it is he's doing and showing it to you too, because it's got that wandering kind of quality, even just across that page and a half. And the next one that comes immediately afterward, on liars, enacts this even more fully. He again starts out talking about the properties of the mind, the memory, the intellect, and then the quality of invention or imagination. So in this one, it's not one of the cases where he starts out with the topic of the title and then wanders off over here somewhere. He starts out over here somewhere, and then he gets to liars a few pages in.
It's really striking. Although before we get to that, I do want to point to one moment early on in this where he's talking about memory, and he's talking about how he has a very poor memory. He's very insistent upon this, and it will get reflected in several different ways across the essay. But one of the first ways it comes up is when he's talking about how his friends treat him because of this. And he says, I am better at friendship than at anything else, yet the very words used to acknowledge that I have this affliction, this bad memory, are taken to signify ingratitude. They judge my affection by my memory and turn a natural defect into a deliberate one. We begged him to do this, they say, and he's forgotten. He's forgotten his promise. He's forgotten his friends. He never remembered, even for my sake, to say this, to do that, or to mention something else. I certainly do forget things easily, but I simply do not treat with indifference any charge laid on me by my friends. Which is, first off, he's bringing a lot of his own personal experiences into this. That is a hallmark of where he is drawing his knowledge and his understandings and how he's presenting these ideas to the world. And secondly, because he's bringing so much of himself into this, it becomes very tempting to do that thing which, you're not supposed to do, of diagnosing somebody. This is so much like somebody who has ADHD. I'm not going to necessarily diagnose this. I'm just saying that there are some resonances that sounded very familiar to behaviors that people I know who have ADHD have talked and complained about. And he writes about them so vividly that it was like hearing one of my friends talk. That's more where I'm coming from than trying to say, oh, he had this. And it really pulls you into him as a person. It helps you build the parasocial relationship, we might call now, with this author as somebody that you're invested in hearing what he has to say and what he's going to say next. And that's one of the main joys of the essays, I find.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. You have a sense of how he feels, right? That parasocial quality you're just mentioning. I feel like that example you were giving kind of has resonances in sort of three different directions, right? One of them is that, Lisa, that sort of parasocial quality where we feel like we're in a conversation with somebody and it reminds us, like you said, of conversations with other friends. Another context that it brings to mind is, what do we mean by friendship? And that's something he's going to think about a lot. Like, is the person who's angry at you for failing to remember something really your friend? Or what kind of friend is that? And that's something he's going to think about. And then the other dimension that's kind of interesting to me, as somebody who's really interested in medieval ways of thinking, that some of which persisted well into the 16th century, if you're the kind of person who doesn't have a very good memory, one of the ways they would talk about this in terms of faculty psychology would be that your memory retaining faculty of the mind is kind of too soft. It's too pliable. It's too supple. And the forms of the things you want to remember don't stick. Conversely, though, that makes you have a wild imagination, right? Because you're just taking the impression of this and that and this and that. And also you would have presumably powers of invention that would also come from that proliferation, that supple, soft mind. Anyway, so there's all these different ways in which, like, stuff he says kind of go off in these different possible directions, which is very much the flavor of the work as a whole.
Yes, and there are several things that I want to jump off from what you just said.
I feel like he'd really appreciate that we're just going, and then you could talk about this.
Exactly. So the one thing I first want to say was that he does eventually get around to talking about liars. The idea of memory is that it's very important to have a good memory if you're a liar, because you need to keep your story straight, basically. And the truth weighs upon, like what actually happened, what actually is the truth, weighs upon you more than any invention that you come up with could possibly do, he argues. And so therefore you'd have to be really skilled at being a liar in order to successfully do this. And he gives us a lot of examples of diplomats who can't keep their lies straight. And especially, you ask somebody who you think is lying to you to say it again and again and again, and eventually it won't add up. Think basic police technique.
Yeah. And this, as a result, this essay ends up it's an example of one of the ones I mentioned before, that it ends and you're like, what? Because you have like these various anecdotes about people who are more or less effective liars in the political arena. And then we have one that's about Pope Julius II having sent an ambassador to the King of England to incite him against King Francis, of France. And from this statement, the King of England at once inferred what he later found to be the case, that the ambassador was inclined to be on the French side. When he informed the Pope of this, the ambassador's property was confiscated and he barely escaped with his life. The end. And you're like, what? I was totally in that place.
And so that's like an interesting philosophical, logical argument. It's interesting to see how that gets paired with the very personal material. Like, they're playing off each other in a sense.
Well, it's almost like I hadn't thought of it quite this way before, but now we're talking about the kind of personal, parasocial kind of quality. It's almost like you're talking to a friend and you're having this conversation that, it's time to go to dinner or something. You know what I mean? Like, that's how conversations are, right? That's how people talk. But the formal structures of writing don't normally provide for that kind of abruptness.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that you mentioned is the possibility of having a bad memory leading to having a vivid imagination. And one of the essays that is quite remarkable is all about the power of the imagination. And he's using imagination here in the older sense of the term, which is just the ability to have an image in your head. So certain types of thinking rather than like fantastical invention as imagination. This is just imagination, the ability to like see things when you're thinking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that in the essay where he talks about the imagination, and not just the imagination, but the power of the imagination, it's an essay that's all about the body.
Yes.
Which is, right, it's paradoxical because you would think, it's about the imagination, it's about the mind, it's like this other side of the mind-body split. But like, au contraire, that is not at all what's going on for him.
It is incredibly bodily. And it's bodily in the sense of it's about sex, and gender,
Yeah.
and also about bodily functions. There's a wildly...
Like having sex, to be clear.
having sex. And then also there's a big...
Or not having sex, or...
And there's a big thing at the end about farting.
Yeah. And all kinds of stuff. Like it basically, and I was trying to see, is there a generalization that we can use to capture a lot of the ways in which he's talking about the body here? He's talking, I think, at least to some extent, about to how much control do you have over your body, and what does that control look like, and whether that's the power of the will, which is something Augustine talks about a lot, and he's not coincidentally, I think, mentions Augustine a few different times in this essay, or, whether with regard to sexual activity, how much of it's totally under your willful control and how much of it isn't. And then things like the evil eye, or things like women who have births that are not totally, are unsuccessful, and the child is affected in some way in the womb. He's putting the imagination as the driving force behind all of these things.
Yes. And because of this, and I guess because we just don't think of the imagination as working quite this way, these are incredibly striking stories of people who think really hard about something, and then
it happens.
And then something happens, and then they transition, and then they're cuckolded or impotent, and then whatever else happens to them.
One of my favorite examples in here, because it's just wild, is that whole long story that he tells about a person, a slightly older man who had gotten married and was really worried that the wedding night was not going to go all that great.
Oh, yes.
And so Montaigne's like, "Don't leave it to me. I will deal with this." And so he makes an arrangement. He says, if there's a problem, he says, "You can go to bed. Don't worry." He says, "I promised him that at need I would not withhold a miracle which it was in my power to perform, provided that he would swear on his honor to keep it absolutely secret. He was merely to let me know by a certain sign when they brought in the midnight refreshment if things had gone badly with him." And so he's worried, right? He has a disturbed imagination. So I said, "Get up under pretense of chasing us from the room, and as if in sport, pull off the bedrobe I was wearing." We were about the same height. This he was to put on himself and wear until he carried out my instructions. These were that he should retire to make water, repeat certain prayers 3 times and go through various motions, and then tie around his waist the ribbon I had put in his hands, and very carefully place the metal which was attached to it over his kidneys, to figure in a certain position. And then he should return to the business at hand, but don't forget, he said, to throw my robe on the bed so that it would cover them both. And he says, it worked. He says, "My talisman certainly proved itself more Venerian than solar, more active than preventative." Right? So it's a ridiculous story, but it's about how your mind can make things happen in your body or not happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's a placebo effect.
Sure.
Deal,
Yeah,
right?
that's what we would call it. Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody's having a panic attack, an anxiety attack about their performance, and is given a talisman that they're told by someone that they trust will do this, and it works because that is what they needed. And Montaigne says, "I was led to do this deed, which is so foreign to my nature, by a rash and troubled humor. I'm opposed to all feigned and subtle actions. I hate sleight of hand,
but he
not
was
only in games, but even when it serves a purpose. The way is vicious, even if the deed is not." But he still did it because it needed to be done in this circumstance.
You really have a feeling of, why not?
Yeah. Well, you also get a feeling of how, even though he's interested in what we might call philosophical questions and philosophical arguments about like what is the right thing to do and what is the right way to be and what is good and what isn't, it's always held very much as sort of ad hoc, right? Like things get complicated, things get specific.
Yeah. And friendship, right? I mean, that's what's motivating him there, right? Again, it's that sort of friendship being in the background of what's being talked about. This was a count of very good family and an intimate friend of mine, right? So even though he doesn't talk a lot about friendship here, I mean, that's the thing that's motivating his actions, right? Or at least to some extent.
Well, we should talk about his famous essay on friendship.
We definitely should. Before we leave on the power of the imagination, though, briefly, I can't leave it complete without just giving a whirlwind tour of some of the other examples. There's a woman who thinks she'd swallowed a pin with her bread, shrieking and writhing as if she had an unbearable pain. But a clever fellow figured out that maybe it was just fancy, right, or imagination. So he made her vomit and then stealthily threw a bent pin into what she threw up, believing she'd thrown up the pin. She's fine. And other examples. And perhaps the most remarkable one in here, which I'm struck by because it's interesting to think about how we read it and how he's reading it, is the account of Marie Germain. This is a little bit earlier in the same chapter. Personal account. He says, "Passing through Vitry-le-François, I was shown a man whom the Bishop of Soissons had confirmed under the name of Germain, but whom all the village's inhabitants had both known and seen to be a girl, and who had been called Marie up to the age of 22. And he attributes this change again to the imagination, right? So it's an odd passage, and I think it would take a long time for us to kind of unpack it fully. But it's one of the moments where I think it really exposes the way in which a text that's, 400 years old, over 400 years old, is inhabiting a very, very different world, but it's got features that we see as part of our own world and like mediating between that. I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Did it strike you, that passage?
It did. And as you say, it's a little bit tricky to unpack. And I feel like this is a moment when I would want more scholarly context before saying anything about it, especially understanding how he's understanding the connection between the imagination and the body. But as you're saying, another passage that has that similar striking true or striking relevant to us now is the chapter on friendship, where he talks about a very special friend he has.
Etienne de la Boétie. That is a really interesting chapter and a really interesting relationship.
Yes.
The chapter is kind of neat because it's not just about friendship. I mean, it culminates in talking about friendship, and in particular talking about the kind of friendship that Montaigne wants to talk about and describe that relationship. Because he talks about all different kinds of human relationships in that essay. The relationship of children and their parents, the relationship of brothers, the relationship you might have as a man to a woman, that is a sort of erotic relationship, marriage, which he separates out from his relationship with women, which I thought was just charming. I rolled my eyes a little bit.
There's a whole thing there.
There's a thing there. And then what he calls that alternative, which morality forbids.
Yep.
Pull the shade down on that.
But let's talk about ancient Greece for a while.
Let me tell you about Etienne.
Yeah, and then we're going to have a very separate discussion about his very good friend Etienne de la Boétie.
Exactly.
Yeah, in my translation, the chapter is titled On Affectionate Relationships, trying to capture more senses of what that French word that we would now translate as friendship could mean, how it encompasses many different things, which I think is an interesting choice. But yes, he met a young man when he was a young man, and they had heard about each other. They'd been told about each other by friends. And then when they met, they hit it off tremendously. It was like twin souls meeting in the night. And it became a very intense friendship of fellow-mindedness that is not described in sexual terms.
No, he's careful about that. But wow, they're in love.
But they're
100% in love. There's this beautiful little passage. I just love it. He says this: "It was not one special consideration, nor two, nor three, nor four, nor 1,000. It was some mysterious quintessence of all this mixture, which possessed itself of my will, and led it to plunge and lose itself in his, which possessed itself of his whole will, and led it with a similar hunger and a like impulse to plunge and lose itself in mine." I wrote, whoa, after that.
I will see that passage of yours and raise it with, "If you press me to say why I loved him, I feel that it cannot be expressed except by replying, because it was him, because it was me."
I know, right? It's like very beautiful. And yet you're like, wow, guy.
Well, yeah, it's true. And yet I don't want to force him into a corner or anything, so to speak, because I mean, you read that and you're like, oh, yeah, no, I know what you're talking about. But then you're like, no, wait a minute. I do know what you're talking about because I have these kinds of friendships. I mean, they're very rare. He seems to think you can only have one. I'm not so sure, but whatever. Where it's like, oh, no, we are just in lockstep in a certain sense. We are vibing for reasons beyond explanation. And this is a very profound and productive relationship for the both of us that I want to encourage you, and I want you to encourage me, and I want to do things with you, and I want you to do things with me that are not necessarily sexual.
Yeah. And I think you're right to put your finger on two things. First, like, we don't want to collapse contemporary experience into 16th century experience or vice versa, right? There are going to be all kinds of differences. And yet, the most striking difference I feel like here is what you mentioned just now, his insistence on the exclusivity of this. That is, this is something you can share with one person. And that's perhaps, we'd read a long time ago, the Symposium, right? And perhaps that uniqueness of that bond, that, two parts of a single whole dimension is something that's informing him. He talks about this really explicitly when he says, he gives an example from antiquity of people who were treating each other with this true kind of friendship. And he says, this example is quite complete, but for one detail, the number of friends. For this perfect friendship of which I speak is indivisible. Each gives himself so absolutely to his friend that he has nothing to dispose of elsewhere. On the contrary, he is sorry that he is not double, triple, or quadruple, and that he has not several souls and several wills, so that he can bestow them all on this one subject. And he talks about that. And I thought that was really interesting, especially in the context of the withdrawal into the self and the solitude. What do you make of that? Like, I wonder if this, like, I can only have one friend and I wish I was more of me so I could be more completely absorbed into the single one of him. Like, what is going on there?
It's an interesting question. And I feel like, I don't have biographical context enough to say I do know that the person he's writing about, Etienne de la Boétie, died quite young for reasons. And that there could have been that sense of profound loss and that sense of irreplaceability that might have carried with him. And also that he died needing his reputation restored, in a sense. He died under a political scandal for some of the things that he published that Montaigne feels like was not deserved, that came from a sort of uncareful reading of the text and reading it without context of it having been written by somebody who was quite young and was trying to say one thing that implied another thing, but like that implication was not, should not have been read as fully as it did. Politics, what are you going to do? And so he's trying to rehabilitate his friend in this way. He even goes so far as to say he's going to include this very scandalous text in the book, which he does not, although he includes kind of an introduction to it. And then immediately says, all right, I decided it would be better not to because that would get too many people upset. So I'm going to include these poems he wrote, which he also then doesn't include, even though he includes an introduction. And it's this very interesting absence that's
absent presence kind of.
Yeah, a very heavily marked absent presence.
Yeah. There's this one really neat moment that I saw when getting ready for today. He'll quote lines and little passages occasionally from Etienne de la Boétie's poetry. And there's this one passage where the editor has helpfully said, oh, it's quoted incorrectly. And I'm like, no, that's what happens when somebody quotes from memory.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's interesting. That's the, Etienne that's inside of him. Right?
Yes. And I wonder in that sense if there is a desire to have him be a collaborator in the book. Like that's why it's so important to have his voice included fully, but then he simply can't. Like the outside world is pressuring him in ways that don't allow him to express this the way he wants, which, wow, if that isn't redolent of other romantic experiences between men.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely. And I wonder too, though, if the ways in which the essays are, taking form for him over time as this growing expression of the self, like a thing that grows in the same way that, it grows over time in the same way that he grows or grows older, at least over time. I'm wondering if, to what extent can another's subjectivity be included in that? Like the book is a second self, right? So to what extent can that affective relationship be fully present? Like it's there almost as a shadow or something like that, or the part of Etienne de la Boétie that's inside of him.
Yeah.
And not him himself, kind of.
Exactly, because he's understanding himself as sharing. This is probably not quite the way it's represented in the text, but it's something like sharing part of his soul with Etienne's soul, and therefore he can't represent himself without also including his friend.
I think that's exactly right.
One of the other particularly fascinating chapters is the one that's called On the Education of Children. And it's an interesting one for a number of reasons. First off, formally, this one's a request. The Countess of Gerson, Madame Diane de Foix, specifically read one of his other essays and said, could you please write about this topic? And he's like, well, yes, I want your future child to be raised well, so I will, future son, I should say, to be raised well, so I will happily write about this. And then he writes this very shaggy collection of thoughts about what it's like to raise and educate children and also to have been raised and educated. And his advice on raising children is very interesting, I think, from today's perspective, because he has an idea of like, these are important things for children to learn, but there's also a sense of like, well, don't force the child dogmatically. Reward them rather than punishing them is the better way to go about things.
Yeah. I mean, he's very emphatic. He's like, child should not be sitting in the schoolroom for 12 or 14 hours. They have to be, I think trained is the right word, a little bit differently. He'll say something like, not in this essay, but elsewhere, he'll say like mind and body have to be yoked like two horses that are in harness so that they, run well together. And he doesn't hesitate to kind of suggest how important it is to enforce the learning of Greek and Latin. That's where he tells the story about his own father's approach to Montaigne's own education. And far from saying it was terrible that they only spoke Latin to me, it's in this essay that he talks about how having Latin as his first language enabled this kind of transcendent experience. It's a beautiful passage. He describes how he was reading, and he said, "I'd been languidly following a string of French words, so bloodless, fleshless, and devoid of substance and meaning that they were just words of French and no more. And then, at the end of this long and tiresome road, I came upon a rich and lofty sentence which towered into the clouds. If I had found the slope gentle and the ascent somewhat gradual, it would have been excusable, but the rise was so sheer and precipitous that after the first 6 words, I found myself flying into another world, from which I recognized the depth of the abyss out of which I'd come." I think that passage strikes me because it's really ecstatic in a way that, other than in the On Friendship chapter, you don't get that sense of ecstatic experience quite so much. But it comes from that kind of education he had. It's because he was raised that way that when he sees this Latin language, it takes him, this beautiful Latin poetry, it takes him somewhere else.
Yeah.
But he doesn't tell about his own education until much later. So there's this strange time schema.
Sure. But I think that story captures sort of what's important to him. He says, I think early on, I would prefer that he, your future son, turn out to be an able man, not an erudite one. So I wish you would be careful to select as guide for him a tutor with a well-formed rather than a well-filled brain. In other words, don't look for somebody who is just erudite.
A lot of information.
Yeah, who's going to overload with information. He's going to be really focused on declensions when learning Latin and things like that. Somebody rather who has a good head about them, who sort of can be in the world successfully is more important than somebody who can list all the dates of all the battles. And that's the kind of child you want, is somebody who can appreciate these moments and do things with them. And you want your child to be able to use the material that they're learning rather than recite it back to you.
Yeah. And he uses this metaphor of the horse in a way that really underlines just that quality you're describing. Not the tutor as kind of someone who's got the whip driving the horse, but rather as another horse. He says, "It is well," just after the passage you read, "it is well for a tutor to make his charge trot in front of him so that he may judge his pace and decide to what extent he should himself hold back to keep in step with him." Then he talks a little bit more about those keeping in pace. He says, "It takes a lofty and very powerful mind to conform with a child's gait and to guide it. I walk with a steadier and firmer step uphill than down." So it's this, it's not like a totally free form of education, but it's certainly very different from what might have been the norm.
He also thinks, and I'll quote here, "It is a universally received opinion that it is not sensible to bring a boy up in the lap of his parents. Natural affection makes parents too soft, too indulgent, even the wisest of them. They are incapable of either punishing his faults or bringing him up as roughly and as dangerously as he ought to be." I don't know how we feel about that parenting
I
advice.
don't know, man.
It's interesting. Yeah, he talks about elsewhere having been sent away by his father to live amongst the common folk for a while as a child, and how much good that he felt like that did him, which, it gave him a sense of empathy towards that. And a lot of his advice about raising a child is about empathy. Don't be harsh to the child because you don't want them to grow up to be harsh, but also let the child hurt themselves. Let them fall down and scrape their knee.
Yeah. And also, it kind of goes both ways. He encourages this kind of exposure to other kinds of people, other kinds of knowledge. But how can I put it? In a way that is not where he's sort of integrated into that environment, but rather sort of confronting it at arm's length. And you see that in a passage where he describes how, much like he describes being sent to live with common folk as a child, he says, "This is how you should learn languages too." He says, "I should like a boy to be sent abroad very young, and first, in order to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, to those neighboring countries whose languages differ most from our own, and to which the tongue cannot adapt itself if it is not trained early." So in part, that's just a very logical thing. If you want a child to learn a language without accent, they need to learn it early, sure. But also this idea that your learning happens not in sort of gradually widening circles close to home. And you mentioned already the role of the parents, right? They're too close. They can't be involved. But also you send them away. I don't know how to put my finger on it. Like it's a generous and free idea about education in some ways, but it's also kind of a little disquieting in the sense that it seems the child seems very isolated.
Yeah.
I guess that's what I'm responding to.
Yeah, it seems like the child isn't being nurtured by the people that we would at least expect them to be most nurtured by.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very much kind of goal oriented for their future, paying attention to like who the child will be and what they will need then, which is, I guess, part of education. But rather than any thought to what the child needs now. Obviously avoid things that are probably bad for the child, but like, yeah, no sense of affection towards the child, and especially parental affection and security. Though, he's very proud of his father. He thinks he had a great dad. Says that many times over the course of the book. So it's very interesting. And it's also, I think it ties back again to how his understanding of how to raise children is based on how he was raised.
Yeah.
And reflections he's had on that, and a little bit of like hearing what other people have had to say, but largely based on his own experience, on his self. And this is, I think, both a feature. It's something that's quite interesting and enjoyable to read. And as you start to like grow this parasocial relationship you have with him as a writer and as a person, this is the stuff you're here for. But it also means that his philosophizing and advice giving can often feel half thought or half baked.
Yeah, maybe. And growing out of his own experience in a way that is in some ways kind of very positive, in some ways kind of a little unnerving. Like, maybe we said already how it's good, how he's like saying you shouldn't be cramming your child with information 14 or 15 hours a day. But he says, instead do this. And this is what he says. He says, for our pupil, a little room, a garden, table and bed, solitude, company, morning and evening. All hours shall be alike to him, and all places will be his study. For philosophy, since it is the molder of judgment and manners, shall be his principal lesson, and it has the privilege of entering everywhere. Like, on the one hand, good. On the other hand, I'm like, wow, that's a lonely child.
Yeah.
And so, like you said, the parasocial relationship kind of helps us kind of have a way of thinking about that, maybe.
Well, those are just a few of the many, many essays in this book. We didn't even talk about the section where he talks about passing kidney stones or his defecation habits. It's all in here. I'm glad that we got to spend some time reading it, and I've always wanted to force myself to start diving into this book, and I'm glad that we just picked out a few essays.
Yeah.
Because I also tried reading it from the beginning, and those first few essays do not welcome you in very well.
No. And it's a book that really, really welcomes you just dipping into it. You just pick up the book and you're like, oh, this one looks interesting. You can go in anywhere.
You don't even need to read a full essay.
No.
It's fine. Just start anywhere that catches your eye and read as long as you want.
Yeah. This is exactly what he's inviting you to do.
I mean, you absolutely can read the full essay, and there is some merit to that, but it's not necessary to get pleasure and to get what I think is most interesting to get from this book.
Yeah, it's like if you were calling somebody up on the phone and they chat to you for a while. There's this interesting friend that is always good to talk to, but you never know what you're going to get.
Exactly. All right. Well, that is Montaigne. What book are we doing next?
Our next book is going to be a book that came out in 2011 called Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, Stories of Nishnabeg Recreation, Resurgence, and a New Emergence by Leanne Bita-Samose Simpson. And I've really been looking forward to reading this together because I haven't read a lot of her work. Like there's a lot of her work in different modes, and it's really pushing all kinds of boundaries. But an article of hers that I'd read some years ago had a big impact in my thinking, and I've been really eager to kind of slowly and gradually get to a kind of an understanding of her work. And I feel like it's going to require several readings, and I'm really excited to read it together and start opening up a little bit of what's there. I'm excited to talk with you about that work. It was very interesting to read, but that'll be next time. Until then, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can always email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We would always love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/72. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn really soon.